This is Audible.
Deep Domination, Bought by the Billionaire, Book 2. Written by Lily Valente. Narrated by Summer Roberts and Tyler Dunn.
Chapter 1. 6 years ago. Jackson. They had only been in the stuffy room at the end of the hall for half an hour, but Jackson was already sweating beneath his clothes and dangerously close to losing his shit. The interrogation was a joke. It was clear that in the minds of the two military police officers charged with getting his side of the story, he had already been tried and convicted. He didn't know either of them, but they weren't hard to read. The older, red-headed man with the crooked nose wanted to pound Jackson unconscious, and his partner, a young, fuzzy-haired brunette who barely looked old enough to have graduated from the academy, alternated between flushing red with anger and paling with disgust. And fear. She was afraid of him, too. He could see it in her eyes when her guard faltered. She was horrified by what she was certain he'd done. She was also scared of what might have happened to her if she'd encountered him on one of the more far-flung Quantico trails, deep in the forest where no one could have heard her scream as he forced himself on her, as he'd raped her. The thought made his stomach roil and bile rush up the back of his throat. He would never do that to a woman. Any woman, let alone the woman he loved. Being questioned in connection with something like this was deeply disturbing, but the fact that he was accused of violating Harley was just too much. He felt dizzy, sick, and panicked, but also strangely above it all, like a ghost hovering in the air. Both had name tags on their uniforms, but Jackson couldn't seem to focus long enough to make sense of the letters stitched in black on gray. The entire morning had been too surreal, from the time the officers knocked on his front door to the moment he learned he was being questioned in connection with the rape of Harley Garrett. "I didn't rape Harley. I love her." The reality that she was no longer alive to love hit him all over again, making it hard to swallow past the fist of emotion shoving up his throat. "I loved her," he continued, his voice hoarse. "So much. I would never have hurt her. And if she were here right now, she'd tell you that. She'd tell you everything we did was consensual." "So you believe Miss Garrett was a truthful woman?" the female officer asked. She was pale now, not flushed, but Jackson was too frustrated to wonder if that was a good sign or a bad one. "Yes," he said. "Dicked you?" Jackson balled his hands into fists on top of the table, fighting to keep the anger from his voice. "Because she was the one who wanted to experiment with being submissive. She's the one who wanted things rough." He lifted his chin and relaxed his fists, ignoring the doubt he could feel seething toward him from the other side of the table. "She wanted to take things even further, for me to gag her and use a whip that would leave marks on her skin, but I told her no." "Why?" Pearson pressed. "I wasn't ready to go that far until we had a serious commitment." "You only hurt the ones you love?" the male officer asked with a barely controlled sneer. "Because power exchange can be dangerous," Jackson said, not bothering to keep the condescension from his tone. "I've been involved in these kind of relationships before, but Harley was new to the lifestyle. I needed to know that she'd questioning her on the other side of the table." She was trembling so badly he could hear the legs of her chair rattling on the floor, a soft, percussive accompaniment to her words, to the nightmarish words spilling out of her pretty mouth. Comprehension hit like a bolt of lightning, sudden and shocking. Jackson's lips parted, but no sound came. His throat closed, and all the blood in his body seemed to rush away, leaving him drained and freezing in the room that, only a moment ago, had felt too warm. But that was before he'd heard Harley describing a date on the beach they'd never had, before he'd watched her lifting her shirt to reveal bruises he hadn't given her. Before she'd sworn that he'd raped her again and again until she could barely stand and had been forced to call an ex-boyfriend to drive her to the police station after Jackson allegedly left her bleeding in the sand. He watched the tape in stupefied fear for a while. Pearson smiled, a cold, victorious smile that made Jackson loathe her more than he did already, but not as much as he loathed Harley. As much as he should loathe Harley. She had conned him, played him, and framed him for a crime he didn't commit, but he couldn't bring himself to hate her. Not that day, or the next, or the next. But by the time he was sitting in a courtroom in front of a judge pronouncing him guilty of rape, he had begun to hate Harley Garrett with the same passion with which he'd loved her. When the judge declared that he would be dishonorably discharged, stripped of all rank and pay, and sentenced to 18 months in a military prison, the last ounce of his affection for Harley shriveled and died, leaving nothing in his heart except a burning hatred. His hatred was a roaring fire that he would stoke every day he spent behind bars, tempering himself in the flames until he was as heartless and remorseless as the woman who had ruined him. The woman who had sentenced a man whose only crime had been loving the wrong girl to a fate worse than death. He would never be the same. He would never love or trust anyone ever again. He would never be the man he was before. That man was dead. Harley had killed him, and now all that was left was to return the favor.
Chapter 2. Present Day. Hannah. Her stranger was clearly angry, furious, but Hannah couldn't have stopped the smile blossoming across her face if she'd tried. It was really him. Him. The man she'd tried to convince herself she wasn't obsessed with for 6 long years. The stranger who had laid claim to her body, captured her imagination, and haunted her dreams. No, he had haunted her awakenings. In her dreams, one glimpse of his face, and she was electrified by pleasure. In dreams, she was transported to the heaven of his arms, blessed by belonging to him in a way she'd never belonged to anyone, not even herself. It was waking up and realizing that the one night they'd shared had been a lie, and that she would never see him again. That was hell. She'd always known that night was a lie, but now maybe he knew it too. Maybe that's why he'd come for her. Her smile vanished so quickly it sent a flash of discomfort through her cheeks. Hannah stared up at him, watching his jaw clench and storm clouds roll in behind his dark eyes. She cringed, wishing she could melt through the floor, or that she at least had a blanket to pull across her body to shield her nakedness. But the polished hardwood held firm beneath her back, and she remained exposed to her stranger, his release cooling on her bare chest as he glared down at her, his hands tightening into fists. She half expected him to strike her, to drive his fist into her stomach as punishment for the smile she hadn't been able to control. Instead, he squatted on his heels beside her, moving with a slow, easy grace that sent a chill across her flesh. She felt hunted, but there was nowhere to run. He owned her. He had bought and paid for the privilege of enacting his revenge, and now her life was in his hands. He would decide whether the next month would pass in pleasure or pain. He would decide how she would pay for her sins, and whether she would leave this island alive. The thought of him beating the life out of her with his large hands made her whimper, even before he brought one of them to her throat. His grip was loose, but his fingers were so long they completely encircled her neck, bringing her claustrophobia surging back with a vengeance, making her blood race and her head spin as he leaned down to whisper inches from her face. "I will tell you this one time and one time only, so listen closely," he said, his voice thick with rage, but so smooth and controlled it somehow made his next words even more frightening. "I am not the man I was before. There is no softness in my heart for you. There is no heart left to soften. I am beyond your reach. I own you, and I intend to break you, and nothing you do will change your fate. Do you understand?" Hannah nodded as she swallowed convulsively, fighting to keep her breath under control as anxiety electrified her nerve endings. "You can smile while I break you, or you can cry," he continued, a smile curving his lips. "But the ending will be the same." His grip tightened, not enough to hurt, but enough to make Hannah's anxiety creep toward full-blown panic. She was seconds from clawing at his fingers when he suddenly released her and stood, wiping his hands on his neatly pressed pants, as if touching her had dirtied them in some way. "Clean up. The bathroom should have everything you need," he said, pointing toward the opposite side of the room. "After you shower, you will stay in this room until granted permission to leave." He turned to go, but stopped before he'd taken 5 steps and spun back to face her, making Hannah's slowing pulse lurch back into high gear. "And if I learn you've disobeyed my order, any order I give you while you're here, all the promises I've made to you will be invalidated. Think about that before you try to run, because I will find you, Harley, and my punishment will make it clear how gentle I've been with you so far." "Harley?" Hannah's brows drew together, but she didn't say a word. She didn't know what to say, what to think. She only knew that she wouldn't be able to organize her thoughts as long as he was in the room. His rage was a fire that sucked all the oxygen from the air and left her gasping, as shocked and confused as a fish dangling from the end of a fisherman's hook. It wasn't until the heavy door closed behind him and she heard his footsteps moving away down the hall that she dared to drag her trembling body into a seated position. Her movement set his seed sliding down the front of her chest. A wave of self-loathing turned her stomach as memories of their brief time together raced through her head. He must have thought she was Harley from the beginning. That's why he'd kept insisting that she say her name, and been so angry when she maintained that she was Hannah North. She'd thought maybe he was one of her family's enemies and wanted confirmation that she was a Mason, not a North, but he'd been waiting for her to confess that she was her sister. Somehow, he didn't know that her twin was dead, and was clearly committed to punishing Harley for whatever sins she had perpetrated against him. Hannah would have liked to believe her sister was innocent of whatever had turned her commanding, but once beautifully passionate stranger into a terrifying man bent on revenge. But she knew better. She would always love her sister, and grieve the fact that Harley had been taken away from her too soon, but she didn't believe in revisionist history. Dying hadn't changed the person her twin had been before she was murdered, and Harley had been a spiteful, inexorable, often frightening force of nature. She had played with men's hearts like a twisted child who enjoys torturing animals before putting the poor creatures out of their misery. Their shared psychiatrist had said Harley's rough handling of romantic relationships was her way of protecting herself from becoming the kind of broken woman their mother had become. But that didn't make Harley's treatment any easier for her victims. Hannah had seen more than one strong man shattered after learning the woman he'd fallen in love with was an illusion, and the reality was a sociopath who seemed to gain succor from breaking people's hearts. Harley had always managed to walk away from the wreckage and disappear before her victim's grief could transform to rage. But now, her sister's bad love karma had caught up with Hannah, who had been paid $1 million to give a man a shot at vengeance. Hannah couldn't tell her stranger the truth. If she told him that she was Harley's twin, not the woman who'd hurt him, she would endanger her and Sybil's future. He wouldn't want her if he learned the truth. Obviously, a surrogate wouldn't suffice, or he would have taken out his frustration on other women years ago. He wanted Harley, the vindictive, psychotic bitch he'd bought, and no one else would do. "What did you do to him, Harley?" Hannah whispered as she drew her knees into her chest, shivering despite the evening sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her, warming the large room. Sometimes Hannah would swear she could feel her sister's spirit lingering nearby, not ready to leave until they could go out of the world together, the way they'd come into it. But now the air remained quiet, empty. She was alone, defenseless, and had no choice but to play a dangerous game with a man incapable of compassion. But maybe Harley didn't deserve compassion. Maybe she'd done something so horrible, so unforgivable, that retribution was the only fitting response. And maybe Hannah would have no choice but to pay the price for Harley's mistakes. As she came to her feet and padded silently toward the bathroom, she hoped she would find a way to survive being shattered by the only man who had ever made her dream about what it would be like to belong to someone, body and soul.
Chapter 3. Jackson. Jackson stormed out of the master bedroom and through the kitchen where the petite housekeeper with the steel-streaked hair was in the middle of cooking something he dimly realized smelled wonderful. But he was too angry with himself to pause to register anything good. He'd come incline where beach gave way to ocean with the force of a wrecking ball. Even from a few dozen feet away, Jackson could feel the earth vibrating beneath his feet each time the ocean found its target. The first few feet of shoreline was pockmarked and jagged from the constant assault, but the sand farther up the beach remained untouched. It was mounded in peaceful dunes not found elsewhere on the island, where a gradual incline allowed the ocean to creep higher up the shore. Brutality had its place, but its reach was limited, and Jackson didn't want to hack away at Harley's protective shell. He wanted to creep past her outer defenses through the sophisticated diversions she'd erected to deflect focus from her weakness, all the way to the deepest, most secret parts of her. He wanted to find the private places she held sacrosanct and rig the halls with explosives. He wanted to destroy her from the inside out, and for that he would need her family. She'd rarely spoken of her father, but when she mentioned her mother or aunt, her voice had softened in a way that had made the younger Jackson envious. Fool that he was, he'd wanted her voice to soften that way for him. He'd wanted to be part of her inner circle, to be one of the few people in the world who had touched her heart. But Harley hadn't let him in that deep. She was selfish and guarded with her affections, whether she was incapable of romantic love or she had simply hated him too much to find a reason to care about him. Jackson couldn't be sure, but he was positive he could use her love for her family against her. He just needed to figure out how to sharpen the weapon and where to thrust the blade to do the most damage. The thought had barely formed before he had his phone in his hand and Hero's number on speed dial. When the other man answered, Jackson spoke over his bright hello. "I'd like you to get close to Sybil North and see if you can find out her real last name," he said.
Racing, determined to make contact with the sun again at the first opportunity. He was concerned for his mother, but he seemed kind, too. At least kind enough that he had spared the time to give her a word of warning. She sensed that he could be valuable to her if she could gain his sympathy. At the very least, he might help keep her from losing her mind. Hannah didn't want to get anyone in trouble, but she needed human connection. She needed to ground herself in this world via someone other than her stranger. If he was her only contact with humanity, she feared it wouldn't be long before she lost what remained of her composure. Her shoulders bunching with frustration, she shut the door and crossed back to her breakfast. She ate the 2 croissants and all of the fruit salad. She didn't know when she would be fed again, and it made sense to fill up. But the delicious baked goods and aromatic coffee didn't taste as good as they should have. Anxiety left a bitter flavor in her mouth that tainted every bite. If someone had asked her documented anxiety disorder, Hannah knew all about Stockholm Syndrome, and she refused to fall victim to it. She would not mistake the absence of cruelty for kindness. She would not empathize or identify with her captor. She would remain focused on her deepest sense of self and her right to human decency. Even if she were Harley and had done something worthy of punishment, she would still deserve that much. Even criminals on death row were allowed to eat, exercise, read, and lift their face to the sun for a few hours each week. As soon as Hawk returned, she would demand that she be allowed a book and the right to walk outside in the backyard. She would make him see that she deserved a reward for her obedience. "He wants to push you into a breakdown, Hannah. You'll be lucky if you're not tortured, let alone rewarded." Her thoughts were chilling, but she refused to dwell on them. She had to remain in the moment and face challenges as they arose. If she let herself start early, her sister had been up to something, and Hannah's gut had insisted it was something bad. There was a chance that her stranger had been her twin's last victim, and had every right to be hurt and angry. But how would Hannah ever convince him that she'd learned the error of her ways if she had no idea what Harley had done to him? "His name," she whispered to herself, curling more tightly under the covers, her overly sensitive nerve endings irritated by the feel of the sheets against her bare skin. Start with his name and go from there. If she could learn the rest of his name, she'd have something to type into a search engine the moment she had access to a computer. His name was the first step. That's all she should focus on, taking one step at a time until she found a way to survive this nightmare with her mind intact. Chapter 5. Hannah. On the fourth night of her captivity, after more long, fear-laced days of monotony and going to bed with tears running down her cheeks, Hannah was awoken by her own groan of relief. She sucked in a breath and held it, her eyes blinking fast as she peered into the near darkness. For a moment, she had no idea where she was, but then she saw the palm trees waving in the moonlight outside the window, heard the gentle rustle of their leaves in the breeze, and felt big, strong hands hot on her breasts. Waking up fast, she breathed into the fingers playing with her nipples. Her stranger plucked and teased at her swollen flesh, sending fissures of excitement washing through her. After days of silence and solitude, his touch was a glass of water in the desert. "You awake, Princess?" he asked, his lips moving against her bare neck, sending another rush of awareness sweeping across her skin. "Yes," she moaned as her bit. "I love that I can smell how much you want me to fuck you." "Yes," Hannah said, anticipation making her shiver. "But first, I want to give you what you asked for." "What's that?" he asked, his gaze still directed down at her pussy, though she wasn't sure how much he could see in the dim moonlight drifting through the window. "Marlena Renee," she gasped as he plunged his thumb into where she ached, but fought to keep her thoughts on track. "That's my name. My parents tried to call me Marley, but I insisted on being called Harley instead." "Why's that?" he asked, setting a steady rhythm in and out of her body that threatened to destroy her ability to concentrate on anything except how much she wanted him. "I thought Marley sounded like a dog's name," she said, leaving out that Harley had also been firm in her belief that twins should have names that started with the same first letter. Harley was only 6 years old when she'd informed their parents that she would be Harley Mason from now on, and that they should take the steps needed to facilitate the change, including ordering a new monogrammed pillow for her and Hannah's shared princess canopy bed. Their mother had fought her at first. Marlena was a family name, dating back 5 generations, but Harley had won out in the end. Harley always won in the end. A thought Hannah drew strength from as she tried to channel her twins' cunning. "What about you?" she asked, lifting into his thrusts. "What was the name on your birth certificate?" "Jackson Xavier Hawk," he said, but his next words banished the thrill of her small victory. "But you can call me Sir. We won't be on a first-name basis while we're here, Harley. And you're mistaken if you think stories about your childhood will make me rethink what I plan to do to you." "I didn't," she said softly. "I just wanted to please you." Then you should roll over and get on your hands and knees. He sat back on his heel.
Money can buy anything, he said with a pointed look. People are always for sale, and usually more affordable than one would think.
But my aunt is innocent,
Harley said, desperation creeping into her tone.
She's done nothing to deserve this.
I think we've both proven we don't give a damn about guilt or innocence. It will only be a matter of time until your business folds, and when it does, I'll be waiting for you to end up penniless on the street. He started calmly toward the bedroom door, throwing his parting shot over his shoulder. And you can trust that my offer of assistance will be much less generous the second time around.
Wait,
she called out.
Please wait, sir.
It obviously pained her to speak the last word, which made her submission all the sweeter. He paused but didn't turn. Yes?
I'm sorry,
she said.
I'll do what you asked. I'll do whatever you say.
I'm not sure I believe you, he sighed, keeping his back to her so she couldn't see the satisfied look on his face. You'll have to show me.
I will, I promise. Whatever you want, sir.
He turned, electricity prickling across the surface of his skin as he faced his prey. Whatever I want, and exactly when I want it. You will not say no to me again, or the choice to leave will no longer be yours. He started toward her, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. You will obey me and submit to me, and what's more, you will make me believe you enjoy your submission, that you are eager and desperate to service me. She swallowed, her throat working visibly as she nodded. I can't hear you, Harley, he said, stopping inches from the bed, forcing her to tilt her head back to look him in the face.
Yes, sir,
she whispered. Yes, sir, what? He pressed. What are you going to do to please me, pet?
Whatever you say, whenever you say it,
she said, the light in her eyes dying a little with every word she spoke.
And I will make you believe that I'm enjoying it.
He smiled as he reached up to cup her cheek in his hand. Very good.
Thank you, sir,
she said, trembling as he ran his fingers up and down her elegant throat. He was tempted to tell her she was doing a shit job of pretending so far, but he was enjoying her fear too much to play that particular chip right now. But if you defy me again, you will find yourself back on that plane faster than you can say lying whore, he said, still smiling as he ran his fingers into her hair and made a fist, drawing a gasp from her throat as he gave her head a gentle shake for emphasis.
Yes, sir.
She sucked in a breath, and he suspected she was fighting back tears, but he didn't care. He had no pity for her. Not any more than she'd had for him when she'd painted her body to make it look like he'd beaten her black and blue. The thought gave him a wonderful idea. You will keep your hands on the bed until I tell you otherwise, and count the blows with me, he said, still stroking her, knowing the gentle way he was touching her now would only make what was to come more shocking. We will count to 50. The number of times I would have had to strike you for you to earn all those bruises you faked before you went to the police. She stilled.
Sir?
It's all right. He braced one hand on the baseboard beside hers as he leaned in to whisper in her ear. I don't blame you. He reached beneath her, rolling her nipples idly between his finger and thumb. I blame the idiots who were too stupid to tell a real victim from a fake one. Her breath rushed out.
Well, I'm sorry anyway, sir. I really am.
He laughed as he pinched her nipple tighter. We both know that's not true, but it will be. He captured her other nipple, plucking it once, twice, 3 times before he added in a whisper, Besides, I was lying too. I do blame you, and I'm going to show you just how much. He stepped back, ignoring her whimper as he kicked her ankles farther apart, widening her stance, bearing her pussy to him along with her ass. He was surprised to find a hint of slickness glistening at her entrance, but not displeased. He didn't give a damn if she enjoyed this. Let her. If she got off on being punished, that was fitting, because he was certainly going to get off on delivering the punishment. He brought his left hand to her waist, curling his fingers around her hip. Welts were rising on her flesh, and her skin was such an angry red he might have felt a little guilty for assigning such a high number of blows if she wasn't the woman who had sent him to jail. And if her pussy wasn't so wet he could smell her arousal sweet and salty in the air. He was hurting her, he had no doubt about that. This was never intended to be a teasing kind of spanking. And she was loving it. Not pretending to love it. Not faking a smile or an aroused moan, but dripping down her thighs, swollen and wet, and dying for him to fuck her, loving it. He'd known going into this venture that Harley was disturbed, but even he hadn't expected her to be this messed up. But she was legitimately turned on by being spanked by the man she'd sent to prison. The only thing more disturbing was how much he wanted to drive his throbbing cock between her flaming ass cheeks. His hand was shaking by the time he...
And with enough strength to hurt, making it clear this wasn't about mutual pleasure. But it didn't matter. The pain summoned pleasure, and together they banished the fear and anxiety that had been plaguing her for days. For the first time since they'd arrived on the island, she wasn't living half in the terrifyingly uncertain future. She was completely in this moment, this spellbinding, mind-numbing moment where she was getting fucked so hard her stinging ass rippled with every rough stroke of Jackson's cock. She was soaking wet, and her pelvis filled with blood, heat, and that heavy feeling that spread through her core just before release. But this build was so much more intense than anything she'd ever felt before. This was a sledgehammer swinging straight at her soul, ready to shatter everything that made her Hannah apart. This was more than submission. This was abandon. This was reckless and dangerous, and afterward, she might never be the same. As the orgasm crept closer, she began to shake, afraid of the wave of pleasure. Now that it was so close, there would be no escape from it. But she was helpless to hold it at bay. The next time Jackson's cock rammed home, she screamed again, her legs buckling as ecstasy, unlike anything she'd ever experienced, rocketed through her, ricocheting through her body like a bullet fired in a steel room. She fell to the floor, and he followed her, kneeling behind her, his urgent rhythm growing frantic as he pushed through her pulsing flesh, forcing her to accept him, even as her pussy clenched down so hard it felt like she might squeeze him in half. This hurt, too. It hurt, and it was perfect. It was wicked, and it was wonderful. She didn't know up from down, right from wrong, or anything for certain, except that when Jackson grabbed a fistful of her hair and wrenched her head back as he came inside her with a roar, there was nothing. It was going to ache like hell tomorrow, and there might even be bruises under that inflamed skin. But right now, there was no pain. Right now, she couldn't feel anything but a floating, helplessly satisfied feeling, unlike anything she'd felt before. Even with Jackson that night in her sister's bed, she was high on what they'd done, and already craving another fix. "Will you have to punish me again, sir?" she asked, shocked by the erotic invitation implicit in her breathy whisper. She was even more shocked when Jackson smiled, a beautiful, pleased with her smile, that made her want to please him again and again, no matter what an insufferable maniac he was, or how much she feared that pleasing him wouldn't be enough to keep him from driving her out of her mind. "Yes, I'm going to have to punish you again," he said, sending a thrill of excitement racing through her. "I'm going to have to punish you until you remember to follow the rules. Now turn around, lie down, and spread your legs. We're going to teach you how not to come." "Yes, sir." Hannah obeyed, fresh heat rushing from her well-used pussy as he brought his hands to the backs of her legs and spread them wide. Chapter 8. Hannah. Hannah held her breath as she gazed down the landscape of her own body at the gorgeous man kneeling between her thighs, suddenly wishing things were different, wishing this was only a kinky encounter instead of a hopelessly fucked up one. Jackson was heart-stopping like this, a man in his element, in complete control. If things were different, she could quickly become addicted to this version of Jackson and all the viciously wonderful things he made her feel. "There is only one rule of cunt-licking club," he said, a wicked twinkle in his eye as he lowered his face between her earth, desperate to get closer to his mouth. She groaned as he pushed deeper, hitting some previously undiscovered place inside her that made her pussy weep for more of him. "Easy," he murmured, withdrawing his magnificent tongue just as the tension building within her began to peak. "Take slower, deeper breaths." She sucked in a deeper breath, but slower was much harder. She was already so close to the brink she could feel the hot desert wind of oblivion blowing in her face, tempting her to throw her arms wide and fly. But this wasn't about pleasure. This was about control, and she was determined to show him she had as much willpower as he had. Fingernails digging into her palms, she forced herself to blow out through her pursed lips for 3 seconds, and then to sip air in through her nose for another 3. But yoga breath only took her so far. As soon as he resumed his wicked work, kissing and nibbling, the could have come 6 times if he'd allowed it. "Please," she begged, panting as she fought to keep from shattering. But it was so hard to resist succumbing to the deep rhythmic pulls as he suckled her clit into his wet heat, even as his tongue undulated inside of her. "Please, please, please." Her begging became a chant, a prayer for mercy he ignored, until she was moaning and writhing on the floor, so close to the edge she felt like she was losing her mind. Only when she was wild for him, teeth bared in a grimace and nipples bruised from her own abuse, did he pull away from her pussy and order in a deep, resonant voice that rippled through her like the first seismic tremor of an earthquake. "Come, princess." Instantly she did. She came so hard she literally saw stars, holes in the night that flashed and blinked behind her closed eyes. She came like desert grass meeting a match, like a boulder crashing down a mountain. Against all common sense, Hannah smiled. "I haven't disobeyed you. I've only opened the door. I haven't left the room, sir." "But you were about to," he said, shifting in the padded lounge chair he'd pulled up beside the door, sometime between the time she'd gone to bed and when she'd finally given up hope of sleep. In the soft moonlight, she could make out the line of his features, but not his expression. She couldn't be sure if he was angry or in the mood to play, the way he had been last night after her spanking. But for some reason, she sensed she wasn't in trouble, at least not yet. But she could be. She pointed her toe, letting it hover above the unblemished concrete as she circled her ankle. "What will you do if I step outside, sir?" "Harley." Her sister's name was a warning, but she wasn't sure if she wanted to obey or not. To be a good girl or a bad one. It was hard to choose when he made punishment feel so good. "I broke a rule last night," he continued softly, his deep voice setting things to stirring inside of her, making her even more anxious for his touch. "What rule was that?" "I told myself I wasn't going to fuck you with my mouth," he said. "That it was too good for you, that you didn't deserve that type of pleasure from me." Hannah brought her foot back to the floor inside, torn between indignation. She wasn't her sister, and she wasn't a foul thing unworthy of his kiss. And empathy. He wasn't the man she'd met that night 6 years ago, and whether she'd had good reason or not, Harley was to blame. Jackson was profoundly changed, but there was still a hint of vulnerability beneath his merciless exterior, and she wanted to get closer to that soft spot, not farther away. She wanted him to feel in control so that he would loosen the restraints he'd placed upon her and let her out of her cage. But how could she make that happen when he'd set so many rules for himself? Rules they seemed destined to break as the chemistry between them flared hotter with each encounter. Finally, she decided she had no choice but to ask and hope he could hear the sincerity in her question. "What can I do to make things better, sir?"
"Nothing," he murmured. "You have no power here, Princess. Remember that. It is the only thing you need to remember."
"I understand," she said, curling her toes into the hard wood as knowing flickered to life in her bones. It wasn't a thought so much as a feeling, a certainty that she should trust her instincts. She wasn't an experienced lover, let alone an experienced submissive, but her instincts hadn't led her astray last night. She'd pleased him, and she could only hope that following that soft, sure voice inside her would please him again tonight. "I know I have no power." She released her hold on the sheet, letting it fall to her feet, leaving her naked in the moonlight. "I'm here for your use." She waited until she felt his eyes on her in the near darkness before she sank to her knees. "So use me, sir." He shifted slightly in the chair.
"Would you like that?"
"Yes, sir," she confessed, knowing she wouldn't be able to pull off a lie when her sex was already slick from the thought of his cock pushing between her lips.
"You'd like me to fuck your mouth?"
She dampened her lips, nerves tingling. "Yes, sir."
"Are you sure?"
He rose from his seat, moving closer with that predatory gait of his. He was wearing dark pajama pants and no shirt, leaving his powerful chest and taut stomach bare to her gaze. He was as stunning as he was crazy, and just a single look at him was enough to make her pussy wetter.
"I won't be gentle. I won't stop when I hit the back of your throat. I'll fist my hand in your hair and force you to take it all, every inch."
She bit her lip, barely holding back a moan of arousal. "Yes, sir."
"I'll fuck you until tears run down your cheeks and spit leaks from your chin."
He stopped in front of her, reaching out to tangle his hand softly in her hair, making her ache to wrap her arms around his legs and rub against the silken fabric of his pajama pants like a cat desperate to be petted.
"I will use you until your jaw feels like it's about to snap in two, and then I'll come so deep down your throat you'll have no choice but to swallow every drop."
She let her head fall back, not bothering to try to control the way her breasts rose and fell as her breath grew faster. She wanted him to see what he did to her, how much she wanted everything he'd just described. She wanted him to take her mouth, and then she wanted him to throw her on the bed and claim her body the way he had last night, soothing away the shame of the punishment with pleasure. She wanted his smile between her legs, his face twisting with passion as he labored above her, as lost in the magic they made as she was. She knew there were no guarantees that she would see Jackson's patient, gentle side again, but it didn't matter. She would take his anger and punishment if that's all he would give her. She wanted him, whatever way he would have her, and she seemed to have no more control over that than the wind whipping through the trees outside, forcing the limber trunks to bend.
"Have you ever deep-throated a cock before, Harley?"
"No, sir, but I want to try."
"It's going to hurt," he warned, "especially the first time."
"I don't care," she whispered. "Please." He made a soft, hungry sound low in his throat, and his hand tightened into a fist in her hair, sending another shockwave of arousal coursing through her.
"All right, Princess. Then sit back on your heels and open wide."
She let her jaw drop and her tongue slip out to cover the edges of her bottom teeth, her body buzzing with awareness as he shoved his pajama pants lower on his hips, freeing his engorged length. Her nipples tightened as his cock bobbed free, seeming even larger from this angle, with the thick, turgid length pointing directly down toward her face. Her eyes widened, and worry that she would choke on him whispered through her. But before anxiety could become fear, he guided his leaking head to her lips and pushed inside. The salty, musky Jackson taste of him washed over her tongue as he glided in slow, pausing as he neared the back of her throat to adjust the angle of her head with the fist still clenched in her hair. Hannah hummed around his thick head, relishing how soft the spongy flesh of his cock felt against her tongue. "Relax your neck," he said, murmuring soft sounds of approval as she tilted her head farther back, relaxing into his control. "Good, now your shoulders. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears. That should relax your throat." She obeyed, and fresh saliva filled her mouth in response, easing the way for him to push deeper, slowly easing closer to the sensitive tissue that she feared would trigger her gag reflex. She tensed instinctively, but he corrected her. "Don't fight me. Relax. Relax your throat, and as you feel yourself about to gag, swallow instead. Just swallow me down." He eased forward, and she obeyed, slowly taking more of him, centimeter by centimeter of his massive length, slipping down her throat while he whispered encouragement. "Yes, princess. Fuck, that's perfect. Don't worry about drooling. Your spit feels so fucking good on my cock." She continued to work her mouth farther down his shaft, her breath coming faster as he kept going, sliding deep, deep down her throat. "Breathe through your nose," he said, his hand gentling in her hair. "Don't panic. You can breathe. There's no reason to be afraid." She moaned around his cock, wanting to tell him that she wasn't anxious. She was insanely turned on and dying for him to touch her, to pinch her nipples and slide his fingers into where she ached. Yes, there was something scary about being invaded by him in a way that felt so unnatural, but it was also empowering to know that her mind was exerting control over her body and insisting that it accommodate her demands. His demands. Right now, they felt like one and the same, and no matter how tough a game he'd talked leading up to this, he wasn't hurting her. He was coaching her, teaching her, the way he had last night. He was insistent, but patient, giving her
down and lifted her hands above her head.
"I'm sorry, sir."
"You've said that, but now I want you to be quiet," he said, shoving his pants to the ground and stepping out of them. "I don't want you to make a sound. Not a moan, not a whimper, not a single sound. Do you understand?" She nodded, eyes widening as he wrapped his hands around her ankles and squeezed. "Not even when you come," he warned. "If you cry out when you come, it will be the last time you come for days, and that's a promise." She pressed her lips together and nodded again. "Good. Now let's see how you're doing after last night." He pushed her legs up and over her head until her knees touched her nose and her ass was up in the air. She was as flexible as ever, and it was fucking hot, but not as hot as the faint red and blue marks covering her pale buttocks. He ran a hand over them, gently kneading the flesh. She cringed slightly, but didn't whimper. Either he wasn't using enough force to hurt her, or she was simply determined not to make a sound. One way to find out. He slapped her ass hard enough to set her flesh to jiggling, and definitely hard enough to hurt the parts of her that were already bruised, but still she was silent. He glanced down between her legs to see her eyes closed and her teeth digging into her bottom lip. She was so obedient when she wanted to be, so eager to be led, so seemingly effortlessly submissive. If he didn't know better, it would be easy to believe this was the truth and everything else had been the lie. Even his gut was sold. It believed she wanted him and needed this sick game they were playing as much as he did. but he'd spent 18 months behind bars for the mistake of believing in Harley Garrett, or whatever the hell her name was, and he wasn't going to make that mistake again. She had always been strong enough not to get swept up. "Look at me," he ordered. She opened her eyes, worry and lust mixing in the blue depths. "You said you wanted to be so full of me there was no room for anything else," he said, as he brought the head of his cock to her opening and applied the barest teasing pressure. "In this position you will feel every inch. You're going to feel me in your ribs. You're going to feel me in your throat, where you're still sore from taking me there." She swallowed, but the worry faded from her expression, and her tongue slipped out to dampen her lips. "Does that excite you?" Her eyes darkened as she nodded. "It's going to hurt at first," he warned, pushing a little deeper until the head of his cock eased inside her. She shook her head slowly side to side. "It will," he assured her, as excited by the anticipation of the first deep thrust as by her slick cunt gripping the tip of him. "I don't plan on going slow. I'm going to take what's mine." Holding his gaze, she silently mouthed, "Then take it, sir." And he had no choice but to give her what she asked for. He dropped his hips, plunging inside her gripping sheath with a groan. Even when she was this turned on, dripping and slick for him, they were a tight fit. Her body fought him, unable to adjust to his girth so quickly. He knew it hurt her, could see it in the way she grimaced as he kept pushing, forcing her to take every inch, until his balls were snug against her ass and his head rammed into her cervix. But by the time he thrust deep a third time, she was bucking into him, eager to be fucked harder, deeper, and he was happy to oblige. He rode her like he hated her, pounding her pussy until he knew she would be even more bruised, and relished the way her slick sheath nearly snapped him in two with the force of her release, like he loved her. He hated the way she smiled through the pain he inflicted, and loved the way she remained utterly silent as she came a second time, milking his cock into the most intense orgasm of his life. He came so hard the world vanished, and there was nothing but throbbing bliss and pleasure and the harmony of two bodies that fit together so perfectly. Twisted and misshapen and perverse, but perfect. She destroyed him and lifted him up to heights no man could reach alone, and he loved it and hated it and loathed himself for his weakness even as he flipped her over and began to take her again, claiming her from behind until his flaccid cock became hard and he'd fucked a third and fourth orgasm from Harley's dripping cunt and refilled the condom with another gush of pain and pleasure, love and hate, him and her. And it was terrible and wonderful. And by the time he'd worn her out and tucked her limp body beneath the covers, he knew it was time to take the next step. He was weakening, but so was she. Now it was time to push her over the edge and to show her there would be a price to pay for refusing to fall.
Chapter 11. Hannah. Hannah spent the rest of the night in the grips of the worst nightmare she'd had in years. It was one of those unput-downable nightmares that sent her surging awake with her heart in her throat, only to pick up where it left off as soon as she managed to fall back to sleep. In the dream, she was one of the Carolina cult girls, 5 young women who had been kidnapped from their homes when they were barely teens and forced to marry into a doomsday cult deep in the Smoky Mountains. They'd been held captive for years before they were found, and were all the news stations could talk about the spring of Hannah's senior year of college. As a leader in the fields of both child psychologically creative, but it could also be terrifying. Ella's body had been liberated from her prison, but her mind was still locked away, trapped in a dangerous pattern of thinking that allowed the man who had stolen her youth to continue stealing from her long after he was behind bars. For months after those sessions, Hannah had suffered from horrible nightmares. In her dreams, she'd been working as a therapist, but was unable to get through to the children who had come to her for help. The children were the saddest of sad cases, innocents who had been violently victimized and bore mental and emotional scars that tore her heart in two. She would wake up covered in a cold sweat, her pulse racing, consumed by the fear that she might not be up to the challenge of freeing her future patients from the unhealthy machinations of their own minds. But when Jackson left her alone in bed, disappearing as soon as he thought she was asleep, Hannah didn't have one of her "you will break." No, Hannah mumbled softly to herself, hugging her knees to her chest. She wouldn't end up like Mary or Ella. She wasn't an impressionable, terrified young girl. She was a strong, intelligent woman, capable of doing what it took to survive, without breaking down or falling under Jackson's dark spell. She refused to think about how close she'd felt to him last night, or how much it had hurt when he'd lashed out and refused to let her say his name. Last night was last night. She'd been exhausted, vulnerable, and lonely. This morning, she was going to keep her eye on the prize. An entire afternoon outside of this damned room, and get her head back in the right place. An afternoon in the sun would surely help with that. It seemed like she'd been in this cage forever, with nothing but memories of her intense erotic encounters with Jackson to keep her company. A taste of normalcy was all she needed to remember that this would be over soon, and she would be back to being Hannah again, with none of her sister's demons haunting her days or owning her nights. And there was a friend out there somewhere. She couldn't forget that. Someone on this island was watching out for her and determined to save her before it was too late. Jackson cast a large shadow in her mind, but no man was infallible, and there was a chance that her secret friend would escape his notice. She clung to that hope as she made the bed and headed into the bathroom to wash the smell of her tormentor/lover from her skin. Hannah showered and braided her hair in a loose French braid that trailed halfway down her back. She didn't know what Jackson had planned for them, but it was windy outside, and she couldn't stand the feel of hair flying into her face. Since moving to the island, her hair practically lived in a ponytail. She'd been tempted once or twice to cut it short and let it whip into a froth of why if she let herself get any closer to him than she felt already, she might very well end up like Ella, locked in a mental prison of her own making. "You have to stay strong," she whispered to her reflection. "No matter what Harley did to him, it doesn't make it okay for him to hurt you. Whatever happens today, remember that. If he punishes you for something you didn't do, it's okay to enjoy it, but it's not okay to think you deserve it." She took a deep breath, meeting her own haunted eyes in the mirror, and wishing she looked as strong as she sounded. With a final deep breath and a silent promise to keep repeating her new mantra for as long as it took for it to stick, she wrapped up in a towel and stepped out of the bathroom to find her favorite breakfast, croissants and fresh fruit, waiting on the coffee table. Even more exciting, however, were the new clothes spread out on the foot of the bed. At the sight of the khaki cargo shorts and black tank top, with a built-in bra, thank God, she was so sick of going without one. Her heart flipped over, and a giddy grin broke out across her face. Clothes! Real clothes! She practically skipped across the room, squealing with delight when she saw the socks and hiking boots on the floor on the other side of the bed. She was going outside, and it looked like Jackson had something active planned. She was so thrilled. After days of stagnantly stewing, she was dying for a long hike through the jungle, or up to the bluffs above the sea, any place where she could breathe deep and feel the eternal, peaceful pulse of nature whispering across her skin, where she could feel her blood rush and her skin heat for reasons that had nothing to do with sex, or the man who was quickly becoming the seductive black hole at the center of her universe. She dressed quickly, hands shaking with happiness as she covered her nakedness, even putting the socks and shoes on, though she never wore shoes in the house at home. But it felt so good to have some.
She looked up at him, eyes wide and curious as she searched his features. But apparently whatever she found in his expression wasn't any scarier than his khaki cargo shorts, because she smiled again.
You're joking, right? There's nothing terrifying on these islands except the centipedes.
You'll see, he said, nodding his head. Follow me. We'll pick up our packs in the kitchen and leave through the garden door.
All right,
she said, practically skipping through the door to follow him down the hall and into the kitchen.
It's a beautiful day.
It is, he said, nodding at the cook as he passed Harley the blue backpack and took the black for himself. Black like his soul, and Harley was a fool to forget that even for a moment.
Hello, Eva,
she chirped to the cook, who nodded nervously before retreating to the other side of the kitchen to continue chopping vegetables.
Lots of water. Thank you so much,
Harley continued, poking into her pack, seemingly unperturbed by the other woman's less than warm response.
Did you remember to pack sunscreen, Hawk? The sun on the islands is intense, even this time of year, and you don't have the base tan I have. You'll get burned faster than you think.
I have sunscreen, he said, amused by her feigned concern. But the first part of the trail is in the shade. We shouldn't need it until then. Harley nodded, not missing a beat as she slung her pack on her back and bounced lightly on her toes.
All right, I'm ready whenever you are.
Her grin was a thing of beauty he couldn't wait to see shrivel as soon as she realized this was no stroll along the beach he had planned, but a grueling 10-mile round-trip hike up and down the side of a mountain. Considering she was probably in worse shape now than she'd been 6 years ago, they would be lucky to make it back to the property before sundown. But he'd brought a flashlight, too. He was prepared and every bit as eager as Harley to start their day. After you. He opened the door for her and followed her out into the sunny afternoon. The trailhead is at the back of the property, on the other side of the orange grove. Harley sucked in a deep breath and tilted her face to the sun as they crossed the wide lawn.
Thank you for this.
You're welcome, he said, unable to keep from admiring how beautiful she was with the sun catching the red in her dark braid and a look of such naked pleasure on her face. I hope you'll still be thanking me by the time we get back to the house for dinner. She shot him a sideways glance.
Me too.
She bit her lip, but continued after a moment.
I hope it's all right that I haven't been calling you sir. I figured that was only for the bedroom, but...
It's fine, he said, but my given name is still off limits. First names are for equals, and that's not something you'll ever be.
Of course.
She nodded, and her shoulders wilted, but after a moment her spirits seemed to lift again. As they circled around a fat palm and made their way through the rows of orange trees, the spring returned to her step. But then he supposed it was hard to take anything too seriously on an afternoon like this one, even revenge or captivity. The smell of flowers and salt water mingled in the air, and the sea breeze kept the cloudless day from feeling too warm. The garden was humming with life and exploding with color, and when they reached the trailhead, the forest seemed to welcome them in with open arms. The feathery leaves of the eucalyptus trees shielded them from the sun, and the cool mud beneath their feet smelled pleasantly of earth and the spicy, fermenting scent of plants breaking down to become part of the soil. For the first half-mile, Jackson shot regular glances Harley's way, waiting for her peaceful expression to grow strained. But by the time they started up the first incline, a slow but steady gain up the mountainside that granted peekaboo glimpses of the waves crashing on the shores below, he was getting lost in the comforting rhythm of one foot in front of the other. Whether it was jogging in formation during training drills in the Marines or his daily run each morning, Jackson's mind was never more at peace than at moments like these, when the motion of the body became a soothing meditation, a way to rise above the demons that haunted him. Even before Harley, there had been darkness in his life, and a deep surety that he would never feel at home in the world. His father had been a cold, merciless man, and his mother far more concerned with her position in society than her husband or her son. Neither of his parents seemed to consider love or emotion a valuable part of human life. From a young age, Jackson had been plagued by the certainty that there was something deeply flawed within him. He felt too much, too deeply, too often. He'd been shattered when his dog Petra died when he was 7. So grief-stricken, his mother had ordered him to stay in his room until he could stop disturbing the peace with his wailing. He'd spent nearly a week in his room, missing school and having his meals brought to him on a tray by the housekeeper, learning the hard lesson that he'd better keep his pain to himself if he expected to be allowed contact with the outside world. There had been other hard lessons learned throughout the years, but none as cruel and final as the one Harley had taught him. She had cured him of his fatal flaw, his overabundance of heart. If his father could see the cold bastard he was today, he would be pleased. He will be pleased when you deliver Harley to his front door and she confesses the truth, and then you will tell Ian Hawke to go fuck himself and prove just how well you've learned your lessons. Usually, thoughts of that final confrontation with his father would send the storm clouds rushing in to darken his thoughts, but the steady sound of his footfalls and the soothing in and out of his breath as the trail grew steeper kept him grounded. His savage beast was so soothed by the walk through the jungle and the stunning view that he and Harley had reached the 2nd-mile marker before he regained the presence of mind to realize his companion wasn't complaining. In fact, she seemed as zenned out by the hike as he was. Sweat dampened her hairline and beaded between her breasts, but her lips were curved in an absent-minded smile, and her breath remained strong and even. And when they stopped at a lookout to soak in the increasingly dramatic view of the sea, she threw her arms open and sighed happily as if she were embracing the world and everything in it. "Enjoying yourself?" Jackson asked, irritation creeping in to disturb his calm as he reached into Harley's pack for a bottle of water.
"Immensely," she chirped. "Incredibly immensely."
"You're in better shape than you used to be."
"Thanks. I try to hike or swim every day at home," she said, grinning up at him as he took a drink of the cool water. "It helps clear my head."
Wonderful, Jackson thought sourly, but his tone was carefully neutral when he said, "So you've discovered a love of exercise as well as an appreciation for food since we saw each other last." Harley's happy expression fell, her brows furrowing as she crossed her arms at her chest.
"If that's a crack about the weight I've gained, I don't appreciate it. I had enough of starving myself during high school and college. I'm healthy, happy the way I am, and it's ridiculous to think a woman only deserves to feel beautiful if she's a size 0.
"I agree," he said, not willing to stoop to petty insults in his quest to break her. "I like you better this way. Your body is stunning." She blinked in surprise, her frown giving way to a pink flush that spread across her cheeks.
"Well, thank you.
She glanced down at her feet as she tucked her hands into the back pockets of her shorts.
I don't know how to act when you're being nice."
"I'm not being nice. I'm being truthful," he said. But her words did give him something to think about. She could be faking this awkward moment, but he didn't think so. It seemed like she really was caught off guard by his honesty, and if that was the case, this day might not have to end in failure after all. Not if he had the courage to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
"All right,"
she said, lifting uncertain eyes to meet his.
"Then I appreciate your honesty."
He nodded before holding the half-empty water bottle up between them. "A drink before we continue? It's another 3 miles to the top."
"Yes, thank you."
She took the bottle hesitantly, holding his gaze as she took several long swallows. The way her throat worked as she drank was sexy as hell, and part of him wanted nothing more than to tug her shorts down around her ankles and have her against the nearest tree, to show her just how much he appreciated all the tempting new curves she'd developed. But sex wasn't part of today's agenda, not in his original plan and not in this new direction he had decided to take. He couldn't afford to have his focus clouded by the increasingly explosive chemistry between them. Sex had served its purpose. Her defenses were weakening. He could read it in the glances she cast his way as they started up the mountain, feel it in the way she swayed closer to his side than she had during the first leg of their journey. It made him wonder if she'd truly been faking her feelings for him all those years ago. Maybe she had felt something, but it simply hadn't been strong enough to compete with her driving need to destroy him. Maybe love and hate could coexist within the same body at the same moment. But hate would always win out in the end. He knew that the way he knew that the sun would set behind the mountain tonight and that Harley would end her day much less happily than she'd begun it.
Chapter 13. Hannah. Something was changing between her and Jackson. Hannah wasn't sure what it was, only that the air seemed easier to breathe after their talk at the lookout. The anger that had been his constant companion since they arrived on the island seemed to drift away in the sweet breeze threading through the trees, and the silence that fell between them became a shared thing, not a door slammed in her face. When she cast furtive glances his way, she found his features soft and relaxed. He looked younger, freer than he had since the moment he removed her blindfold, and so beautiful it was enough to break her heart. This was the man she remembered, a man whose sharply angled face and dark eyes were softened by intelligence and thoughtfulness. A man who could be scary, but never would be, because he knew right from wrong. She knew it was lunacy to believe a shared love of relaxing walks through the woods and her newer, fuller figure had changed Jackson's plans or her fate. But her gut practically sang with assuredness that something was different and things were going to be better between her and Jackson from here on out. He'd seen something in her, something that he could respect, mingled in with all the things he hated. It didn't mean the hard times were over, but it was a start, enough to make her wish this hike would last forever, and they never had to go back to the warped world of the bedroom at the end of the hall. Liar. You like that world, and everything he's done to you in it. Hannah wrinkled her nose. It was true. She did like what she and Jackson did together in bed. But it would be nice to know that when the games were over, she could spend the rest of the night with this man, a person who didn't seem to resent the fact that she was allowed to draw breath. They reached the summit at a little after 2 o'clock and spread out the picnic Eva had packed for them on a large flat rock, staring out at the curious to learn if this new, easier feeling between them would follow them into the bedroom. Curious and a little anxious. If fear were eliminated from the equation when they were skin to skin, it would be all too easy for another powerful emotion to sweep in and take its place. But she knew better than to think that any affection she felt for Jackson would ever be returned. He would never care about her, and anything she imagined she felt for him was the result of a psychiatric disorder. Better to keep him talking and enjoy the respite from their kinky sexual games as long as possible. "Can I ask you a question?" she asked, shifting to face him instead of the stunning view. But Jackson was every bit as captivating, especially when he met her gaze with an unguarded look. "You can," he said, "but don't ask if you don't want an honest answer, Princess." "It's not a serious question," she assured him, not wanting to mar the peace of the... "I think the first time I realized I was turned on by it was when I used to play jewel thief with the little girl who lived next door. She would pretend to be a cat burglar, and I was an American spy working for the CIA." He smiled softly to himself. There was nothing more exciting than catching her with a sack of her mother's jewelry and tying her to a tree. The unexpected confession made her laugh. "That's cute. A little twisted, but cute." "There was nothing twisted about it," he said, smile widening. Lainey enjoyed it, I could tell, even back then. His words made Hannah's thoughts turn back to the night she'd awoken with her arms tied above her head, and Jackson hovering over her in the darkness, smelling like rain, sex, and temptation. The memory made her nipples tighten and a flush of arousal sweep through her. "I bet you could," she murmured, reaching for the chilled bottle of guava juice, hoping it would cool her off. "How about you?"
Had been forced into her deception. Maybe she'd fallen in with bad people, and ruining him had been her only way out. Maybe the thing with Clay had been a way to keep her sanity, soothing herself with one man while she prepared to destroy another, and his death was purely accidental. He knew people who forced others into situations like that now. Drug dealers who forced their girlfriends to become drug mules. Bookies who cut off a little girl's fingers, one by one, when her father failed to pay his debts in a timely fashion. Fathers who sold their own daughters into sexual slavery to solidify an alliance with a rival cartel. He had no idea where Harley had come from or who her parents were. Not even the best intelligence men had been able to pinpoint her origins. But there was a chance she'd come from a rough home life. She could have been born into some dark vendetta against his family and had no choice but to play her part. 6 years ago,
Fawn overskirting she knew would become something magical in an ocean breeze. She'd found delicate gold sandals in just the right size and a bag of high-end makeup waiting for her in the closet. She wasn't sure who had chosen the clothes and cosmetics, but the dress fit her like a dream, and the bronze and pink hues were the perfect shade for her skin. By the time she was finished dressing, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her in the mirror. She was stunning, every bit as beautiful as Harley had ever been, but with a vulnerable look in her eyes that betrayed her swiftly softening heart. It was time to face the truth. She wasn't her twin, and she would never be hard enough or clever enough to pull off this kind of deception. Even if she could figure out exactly what Harley had done to Jackson, there was no guarantee she could find a way to make amends or help him heal. And she wanted to help him heal. The more time she spent with him, the more certain she walked through the now empty kitchen and into a stunning great room with vaulted ceilings, plush couches and chairs arranged in cozy conversational groupings, with a pool glittering at the center of the room. It was a gorgeous space, and for a moment she couldn't help imagining how much fun she and Jackson could have in a room like this, if all the ugliness between them could be put away. Images of her kneeling at Jackson's feet by the pool, both of them naked in the water, or entwined on one of the soft couches, flashed through her head. But she pushed the erotic images away. She had to keep her wits about her, and dwelling on how much she wanted to be with Jackson, really be with him, not as Harley, but as herself, was the kind of distraction she didn't need. Following the scent of something grilled and lovely smelling, she found her way into the dining room. But the large polished wood table was empty, and the bay doors leading onto the front lanai were open. Outside on the redwood decking, a table draped in white linen was set for two, with a gently sweating bottle of champagne, a water carafe filled with lemon slices, fresh flowers, and 2 silver dome-covered plates. But she couldn't focus on the lovely table for long, not when something far more beautiful stood on the other side, framed by 2 flickering tiki torches fitted into the lanai railing. Jackson was facing the sliver of sea visible at the end of the lane, his broad shoulders relaxed and the wind ruffling his still damp hair. His white dress shirt and gray suit pants fit him perfectly, accentuating the power of the body beneath the elegant fabric. The contrast of the civilized clothing and the dangerous man who wore them was the sexiest thing she'd ever seen, reminding her that there were more barriers to a way forward for the two of them than the ugliness of the past. This man was a criminal, an unrepentant predator, maybe even a killer. But even as the thought flitted through her head, she dismissed it. She couldn't imagine Jackson killing. He'd said that he had respect for life, just not hers. Or not Harley's. She pulled in an anxious breath, ready to get this over with, to scatter Jackson's expectations and see if there was anything left worth saving between them once he realized the truth. She crossed the freshly stained planks to stand at his elbow, feeling very small beside him. She barely came up to his shoulder. She hadn't noticed the height difference that much until now, when so much was riding on her being strong enough to find a way to get him to understand. Swallowing past the lump in her throat, she parted her lips to speak, only to have Jackson turn to her and bring one finger to press against her mouth. "Not yet," he said. "We'll get to that part, but first we're going to enjoy the food Eva prepared." Holding his gaze, someone else lead. She glanced up at him through her lashes as she added, "Though I can't say following my sister's charted course was always enjoyable." He cocked his head, seemingly interested, though his gaze was more guarded than it had been a moment before. "And why's that?" "I got hurt a lot when I was following her orders," she said. "When I was younger, I assumed she didn't think far enough ahead to realize the potentially dangerous consequences of her actions. But as we got older, I realized she just didn't care." She lifted a shoulder as she reached for her glass of champagne, needing a little liquid courage as she skated closer to the truth. "I mean, I had it better than the friends or boyfriends who got in her way, but she was only protective of me to a point. After that, I was on my own." "And where is she now? Still out there somewhere causing trouble?" "She's dead." Hannah studied his expression, but his gentle nod gave nothing away. "I'm sorry," he said. "I hear losing family can be hard." "It is," she said, her tongue slipping out to dampen her lips. "It's even harder when they leave unfinished business behind. Messes you're left with that you can barely understand, let alone know how to clean up." His brows drew together, but before he could respond, something buzzed in his lap. He shifted his weight, pulling a cell from his front pocket and glancing quickly at the screen before he pushed his chair away from the table. "Excuse me, I have to take this. Business. But keep eating. No sense in both our dinners getting cold." "Of course," Hannah said, heart thudding in her ears with a mixture of frustration and relief as Jackson disappeared through the doors leading into the dining room. She heard him say hello, but his next words faded away as he retreated deeper into the house. Adrenaline pumped through her system, making her hands shake as she set her silverware down beside her plate. For a second, she'd thought he was about to put the pieces together, and a new fear had sliced through her head like a laser. What if he didn't believe she was telling the truth about being Harley's identical twin? Considering everything he'd been through, he might be more inclined to think her explanation was just another lie. And how on earth would she prove otherwise? She had no pictures of her and Harley together, no birth certificate except the forgery she'd brought with her to Tahiti. And what would he do to her then, when he was certain he couldn't trust a word out of her mouth? She sensed it would be bad, and that she would suffer more for having made her way past his first line of defenses. He'd let her in today, more than he ever had before. If she betrayed what little trust he'd given her, he would make sure she suffered for it. She had to make a decision, right now. She might not get another chance to exercise her free will before Jackson
Be beautiful in that dress, but he hadn't been prepared for the sucker punch of desire that had nearly leveled him when he'd turned to see her standing next to him, looking up into his eyes like all she wanted in the world was to rewind the clock and go back to when they first met. To go back and make things better. To give them a shot at having more than some intense hate-fucking on the way to hell and back. She'd taken his breath away. He'd wanted to take her right there on the lanai, shove her dress up and rip her panties down, and fuck her from behind with the wind blowing that dress around their joined bodies as he made her come, screaming his name loud enough for the servants to hear. He wanted to fuck her until there were no more lies left between them, just the truth of how hot they were together, electric like nothing he'd ever known. But instead, he'd forced himself to sit down and get something in his stomach before things got ugly. And things... What else? He demanded.
Sybil has nightmares, the pearl farmer said, affection and pity clear in his voice. Her medications make it difficult for her to come fully awake during the night and leave the nightmares behind. She's called out several names during her sleep, but so far nothing that would aid in the discovery of another last name, if there is one.
There is one, I'm certain of it, Jackson said, pacing back toward the bedroom door. Is there anything else, or should I look for someone who will make sure I get what I pay for?
Don't send anyone else, Hero said, pitch rising. I'm making progress. I just need more time. I found a letter Hannah wrote as a child and an old photograph yesterday. I took pictures of them with my phone so I could send them to you. There may be more keepsakes that will offer clues, but Sybil woke up from her nap before I could find them.
Jackson fought the urge to curse. It was gone. But she wouldn't get far. Pulse leaping in his throat, Jackson jabbed Adam's contact profile on his phone, issuing orders the moment the other man picked up. Our guest decided to make a break for her freedom while I was inside taking a phone call. She doesn't have more than a 10-minute head start. Fetch the gardener and start looking down toward the beach. I'll check the road back toward town. Yes, sir, Adam said, hanging up without bothering to say goodbye. Slipping his phone back into his pocket, Jackson turned and started walking up the road toward town, carefully scanning the ground for signs of which way his prey had run. He was going to find her, and then, one way or another, he was going to force the truth out of her pretty mouth and find out everything she'd been hiding.
This has been Deep Domination, Bought by the Billionaire, Book 2. Written by Lily Valente. Narrated by Summer Roberts and Tyler Dunn. Copyright 2015 by Lily Valente. Production copyright 2016 by Lily Valente. Jackson and Hannah's story continues in desperate domination.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.